June 7, 1942. Aboard the battleship Yamato, somewhere in the gray Pacific waters northwest of Midway Atoll, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood motionless in his private quarters. The most powerful naval commander in the Japanese Empire held a single sheet of paper in his hands, and those hands, witnesses would later recall, were shaking. The message had arrived just after dawn, transmitted in terse military code from the carrier Hiryu before she too succumbed to the flames that had already consumed her 3 sister ships. 4 fleet carriers lost in a single day: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The names that had struck terror across the Pacific for 6 months were now nothing more than burning hulks sliding beneath the waves, taking with them over 300 aircraft and thousands of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. Before we discover how Japan's most brilliant military minds confronted the magnitude of this catastrophe, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The silence in Yamato's command center was absolute. Staff officers stood frozen at their stations, unable to process the reports streaming in from the disaster unfolding 200 miles to the east. These were men trained since childhood in the rigid protocols of the Imperial Japanese Navy, men who had learned to maintain perfect composure regardless of circumstance. Yet now they stood like statues, their faces masks that barely concealed the shock reverberating through their souls. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier strike force, had been transferred to the light cruiser Nagara after his flagship Akagi became an inferno. His first message to Yamato had been delayed by 3 hours as communications systems failed and chaos consumed what remained of his fleet. When his words finally reached Yamamoto, they carried the weight of a man watching his entire world collapse. Enemy dive bombers achieved complete surprise. All carriers hit simultaneously, unable to launch counterattack, requesting instructions. Yamamoto read those words again and again, as if repetition might somehow change their meaning. Around him, junior officers waited for orders that did not come. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the man who had promised the Emperor 6 months of victories, now faced a reality that his strategic genius had not prepared him for. The American carriers that were supposed to be caught unprepared at Midway had instead been waiting with a fury and precision that had turned Japan's greatest naval advantage into its most devastating defeat. Commander Yasuji Watanabe, Yamamoto's operations officer, finally broke the silence. "Sir, the fleet awaits your orders. Should we proceed with the Midway invasion?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Yamamoto turned from the window where he had been staring at nothing, his reflection ghostly in the gray morning light. The question of whether to proceed with the Midway invasion was already answered by the burning carriers his men were desperately trying to save. Without air cover, the invasion force was defenseless. Without those 4 carriers, Japan's entire strategic position in the Pacific had fundamentally changed in the span of 5 minutes. That was how long it had taken. 5 minutes for American dive bombers to catch his carriers with their decks crowded, with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. 5 minutes to undo 6 months of careful planning and flawless execution. The other admirals in the command center knew what Yamamoto was thinking because they were thinking it themselves. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been unstoppable. Pearl Harbor had been a masterpiece of surprise and devastation. The British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse had been sunk off Malaya. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen like dominoes before Japan's advancing forces. The carrier strike force commanded by Nagumo had raided Ceylon, driven the British Eastern Fleet from the Indian Ocean, and ranged across the Pacific with absolute impunity. No force had been able to challenge them. No enemy had been able to touch them. Until yesterday. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi had gone down with the Hiryu, refusing to abandon his ship even as flames consumed her. His final message had reached Yamato just an hour before. "I alone am responsible for the loss of Hiryu and Soryu. I shall remain with my ship to the end." It was the code of Bushido, the warrior's way that demanded a commander take responsibility for failure with his life. But Yamaguchi's death would not return those carriers to the fleet. It would not bring back the pilots whose skill and experience could not be replaced. It would not undo the strategic disaster that was still unfolding in the waters near Midway. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's senior staff officer, approached with another dispatch. "Admiral, reconnaissance reports that American carriers are withdrawing to the east. They are not pursuing." The words carried a strange, hollow quality, as if the Americans' decision not to press their advantage somehow made the defeat less complete. But everyone in that room understood the truth. The Americans did not need to pursue. They had already won the most decisive naval victory of the war. Yamamoto finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear enough for every officer to hear. "Cancel the invasion. All forces will withdraw to the northwest. We will rendezvous at a point to be designated." There was no discussion, no debate. The orders were transmitted immediately, and the greatest naval armada Japan had ever assembled began its retreat. The retreat order brought no relief to the men processing what had happened. In the officers' wardroom of the Yamato, maps that had shown the projected advance across the Pacific now mocked them with their optimism. Red arrows, indicating Japanese movements, still pointed confidently toward Hawaii, toward the American West Coast, toward a future that had been incinerated along with those 4 carriers. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Fujii, an intelligence officer, stood before these maps with tears streaming down his face that he made no effort to hide. His brother had been a pilot on the Kaga, past tense. That was how quickly the mind adjusted to new realities. What made the loss unbearable was not just the ships themselves, though each carrier represented years of construction and billions of yen in resources that Japan could ill afford to replace. It was what those carriers had symbolized. They were the proof of Japan's technological and tactical superiority, the instruments through which the empire would dominate the Pacific and force America to accept Japan's new order in Asia. They had been untouchable, invincible, the steel embodiment of Japanese naval supremacy, and they had burned. All 4 of them had burned. Admiral Motomi Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, sat at his desk, composing the preliminary report that would eventually reach Tokyo and the Imperial Naval General Staff. His brush moved slowly across the paper, forming characters that felt like they were carving his own obituary. How did one explain to the Emperor that the Navy's most powerful striking force had been caught completely unprepared? How did one describe the catastrophic failure of reconnaissance that had allowed American carriers to approach undetected? How did one justify the decision to rearm the attack planes for a second strike on Midway instead of keeping them ready to attack enemy ships? Every decision that had seemed reasonable at the time now looked like criminal negligence in hindsight. The wireless room continued receiving reports from the screening destroyers that were searching for survivors in the oil-slicked waters near Midway. The numbers were fragmentary and incomplete, but they painted a picture of devastation that grew worse with each transmission. Akagi had finally been scuttled by torpedoes from Japanese destroyers after burning for 9 hours. Kaga had exploded and sunk rapidly, taking most of her crew with her. Soryu had capsized and gone down in the afternoon. Hiryu had lasted the longest, her damage control teams fighting desperately to save her until the morning of June 5th, but she too had succumbed to the flames. With them went over 250 aircraft, over 2,000 sailors and pilots, and 6 months of careful strategic planning. Commander Watanabe approached Yamamoto again, this time with casualty estimates that were still preliminary but already staggering. The admiral read them without expression, then carefully folded the paper and placed it in his uniform pocket. He would carry those numbers with him for the rest of his life. Every name, every lost pilot, every sailor who had drowned or burned would become part of the weight he bore. Aboard the cruiser Nagara, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo sat in the captain's quarters that had been hastily cleared for his use. His uniform was still stained with smoke from the Akagi, and his face bore the blank expression of a man who had witnessed something his mind refused to fully process. Staff officers who had served with him for years barely recognized him. The confident commander who had led the strike on Pearl Harbor seemed to have aged a decade in a single day. His hands, which had once signed orders with firm precision, now trembled whenever he reached for a pen or teacup. Nagumo had been on Akagi's bridge when the American dive bombers appeared. One moment his flagship had been preparing to launch a devastating strike against the American carriers that reconnaissance had finally located. The next moment, the sky was filled with enemy aircraft diving nearly vertically through scattered clouds, their bombs falling with terrible accuracy toward his vulnerable flight deck. He had watched in frozen horror as the first bomb struck near the midship elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck, where fully fueled and armed aircraft were packed together waiting to launch. The explosion that followed had been unlike anything he had experienced in 30 years of naval service. Commander Tomatsu Oishi, who had escaped from Akagi with Nagumo, now stood before his admiral, trying to deliver a coherent report on the carrier's final moments. But the words came haltingly, interrupted by long pauses as Oishi relived scenes he would see in nightmares for the rest of his life. The hangar deck had become an inferno within minutes. Aviation fuel had spread across the deck in burning rivers, igniting torpedoes and bombs that detonated in chain reactions of destruction. Firefighting teams had been incinerated by secondary explosions before they could even reach their stations. The bridge had filled with smoke so thick that officers could not see their own hands in front of their faces. Nagumo had given the order to abandon ship only after it became clear that Akagi could not be saved. The decision had torn something inside him. A Japanese admiral did not abandon his flagship. A samurai did not flee from death. Yet his staff officers had physically pulled him toward the escape ladder, insisting that the fleet needed his leadership more than it needed his death. He had descended that ladder feeling like a deserter, like a man who had betrayed every principle he had been raised to uphold. The fact that protocol and practicality demanded his survival made it no easier to bear. Now, 12 hours later, Nagumo faced a different kind of death. Not the clean end of going down with his ship, but the slow death of living with catastrophic failure. He had commanded the most powerful naval strike force in the world, and he had led it to annihilation. His decisions, his hesitation in launching the attack planes, his choice to rearm for a second strike on Midway instead of keeping his force ready for naval combat, all of these now appeared as fatal mistakes that had cost Japan the war. The wireless operators aboard Yamato worked in shifts that blurred together as reports continued flooding in from across the scattered fleet. Each transmission brought new details of the disaster, and with each detail came the growing realization that this was not a tactical setback that could be overcome with determination and courage. This was a strategic catastrophe that would reshape the entire course of the Pacific War. Petty Officer Takeshi Maeda, a veteran radio operator who had served through every major operation since Pearl Harbor, found himself unable to maintain the professional detachment that had always been his pride. His hands shook as he transcribed messages describing scenes that seemed impossible. From the destroyer Arashi came reports of pulling oil-soaked survivors from the water, men whose skin had been burned away, who screamed for mothers and wives as medics tried desperately to ease their suffering. From the cruiser Tone came estimates of aircraft losses that kept climbing with each revision. From reconnaissance planes came sightings of debris fields stretching for miles, vast oil slicks marking the graves of ships that had ruled the Pacific just yesterday. Each message was logged, decoded, and passed up the chain of command, where senior officers read them with expressions of disbelief that gradually hardened into grim acceptance. What struck the wireless operators most forcefully was the tone of the messages themselves. Japanese military communications were normally terse and emotionless, stripped of anything that might suggest weakness or uncertainty. But in these transmissions, something else bled through. Commanders who had maintained perfect composure through months of combat now filed reports with subtle hesitations and qualifications that betrayed their shock. Phrases like unprecedented losses and catastrophic damage appeared in dispatches that should have used standardized terminology. The facade of invincibility was cracking, and even the carefully coded language of naval communications could not hide it. Lieutenant Mikio Hayakawa, the senior communications officer, noticed something else troubling in the pattern of transmissions. Normal operational chatter between ships had virtually ceased. The fleet was maintaining radio discipline, but beneath that discipline was a silence that spoke louder than words. Ships that should have been coordinating screening positions and logistics were simply executing their withdrawal orders with mechanical precision. It was as if the entire fleet had been struck mute by collective trauma, each crew processing their own grief and shock in isolation. The most disturbing reports came from the hospital ship Hikawa Maru, which had been stationed well behind the battle line but was now overwhelmed with casualties from the sunken carriers. Medical Officer Lieutenant Commander Kenji Nakamura transmitted requests for additional supplies and personnel, but embedded in his clinical language were descriptions of injuries that haunted everyone who read them. burns covering 90% of bodies, lungs destroyed by inhaling superheated air and toxic smoke, men who had jumped from burning flight decks and been pulled through oil slicks by their rescuers, only to die hours later from the combination of burns and fuel ingestion. These were not the honorable deaths in battle that Japanese warriors were taught to embrace. These were deaths by fire and drowning, deaths that came slowly with terrible suffering. Admiral Yamamoto had not slept since receiving the first reports of the disaster. His staff urged him to rest, but he refused, as if remaining conscious and vigilant might somehow undo what had already occurred. He stood at the navigation table in Yamato's operations room, studying charts that now meant nothing. The careful planning, the intricate coordination of multiple task forces, the brilliantly conceived deception operations, all of it had been rendered meaningless by 5 minutes of American dive bombing. Captain Kuroshima watched his commander with growing concern. Yamamoto's face had taken on a gray pallor, and his movements had become slow and deliberate, as if he were moving underwater. The certainty that had driven the Midway operation now seemed like arrogance in retrospect. Japanese intelligence had predicted that the American carriers would not arrive at Midway until after the Japanese landing forces had secured the island. That prediction had been catastrophically wrong. The assumption that Japanese reconnaissance would detect any American naval forces in time to launch preemptive strikes had proven fatally flawed. The belief that Japanese carriers were superior to their American counterparts in every meaningful way had been shattered by the reality of American resilience and tactical adaptation. Every assumption had been wrong. Every prediction had failed. What haunted Yamamoto most was his own role in creating this disaster. He had conceived the Midway operation over the objections of several senior officers who had argued that Japan should consolidate its defensive perimeter rather than pursuing another offensive operation. He had insisted that drawing out and destroying the American carriers was essential to winning the war. He had promised the Naval General Staff that Midway would be the decisive battle that would break American will to continue fighting. Instead, it had been decisive in exactly the opposite way he had intended. The American carriers had been drawn out, but it was the Japanese carriers that had been destroyed. Commander Watanabe brought yet another report, this one from the heavy cruiser Mikuma, which had collided with her sister ship Mogami during nighttime evasive maneuvers. Both cruisers were now damaged and struggling to keep pace with the retreating fleet. American submarines had been detected in the area, and there were reports of American aircraft conducting searches that would likely locate the crippled cruisers by morning. Yamamoto read the report and added it to the growing pile of problems that had no good solutions. Should he detach escorts to protect the damaged cruisers, thereby weakening the screen around his remaining carriers? Should he order the cruisers scuttled to prevent their capture? Every option led to further losses. The nightmare quality of the situation stemmed from its sudden completeness. Just 48 hours earlier, the combined fleet had been executing a complex operational plan with clockwork precision. Every element had been in position. Every commander understood his role. The weather had been favorable, and initial strikes on Midway had been successful. Then, in an instant, everything had inverted. Victory had become defeat. Certainty had become chaos. The hunters had become the hunted. In the early hours of June 8th, as Yamato steamed northwest away from the disaster, Admiral Ugaki finally completed his preliminary assessment of the carrier losses. The numbers he compiled went beyond simple accounting of ships and aircraft. They represented the dismantling of Japan's entire naval aviation capability. The 4 carriers lost at Midway had carried not just aircraft, but the institutional knowledge and expertise that had taken Japan 2 decades to develop. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant aviation tactician who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack and who now lay injured in Yamato's sickbay, understood this better than anyone. Genda had been aboard Akagi when the bombs hit, and had suffered a broken leg during the chaotic evacuation. Now, despite his pain and the morphine clouding his thoughts, he attempted to calculate what the loss truly meant for Japan's future operations. The pilots killed at Midway represented over 600 hours of average flight experience per man. They were the veterans who had trained over China, who had perfected their skills in countless exercises, who had executed flawlessly at Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific. Replacing the aircraft would take months. Replacing the carriers would take years. But replacing those pilots was impossible. The training pipeline could produce new aviators, but it could not produce instant expertise and combat wisdom. The 4 carriers themselves represented irreplaceable combat power. Akagi and Kaga were converted from battleship and battlecruiser designs, unique vessels that could never be replicated. Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-built fleet carriers incorporating lessons learned from years of carrier operations. Together, they had formed the core of Kido Butai, the first air fleet that had dominated the Pacific. Their loss meant that Japan's remaining carriers, Zuikaku and Shokaku, would bear the entire burden of fleet operations, while Japan scrambled to complete new carriers that were still months or years from commissioning. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. What made the weight even heavier was understanding how the Americans would respond to this victory. Intelligence reports had consistently shown American industrial capacity vastly exceeding Japan's. The United States was already building carriers at a pace Japan could never match. Essex-class fleet carriers were under construction, each one larger and more capable than any Japanese carrier except the massive Shinano still being built. Independence-class light carriers were being converted from cruiser hulls at remarkable speed. Before Midway, Japan's qualitative superiority and veteran pilot corps had been expected to offset American numerical advantages. Now that qualitative edge was gone, and the numerical disparity would only grow worse. Admiral Ugaki sat back from his calculations and allowed himself a moment of despair that he would never show to his subordinates. The war was not over. Japan still held vast territories and possessed powerful naval forces. But the trajectory had fundamentally changed. Before Midway, Japan was advancing and America was reeling. After Midway, the momentum had shifted in ways that all the courage and determination in the world might not be able to reverse. He thought of the young pilots who had died in those carriers, boys who had believed they were sacrificing themselves for certain victory. What would they think if they could see these numbers, this cold assessment of what their deaths had actually accomplished? In the privacy of his quarters, Admiral Yamamoto allowed himself to confront thoughts he could never voice to his staff. He poured a small cup of sake, a ritual he normally reserved for moments of reflection after successful operations. Tonight, it felt like a funeral rite. The cup trembled slightly in his hand as he raised it in silent salute to the thousands of men who had died under his command. He had studied at Harvard, had served as naval attaché in Washington, and understood America's industrial might better than perhaps any other Japanese officer. That knowledge had made him oppose war with the United States from the beginning. But when ordered to plan Japan's opening strikes, he had done so brilliantly, hoping that decisive early victories might force a negotiated peace before American power could fully mobilize. Midway was supposed to be the final blow that would bring America to the negotiating table. Instead, it had likely ensured that the war would continue until one side achieved total victory, and Yamamoto knew, with a certainty that made his chest feel hollow, which side that would be. He had told Prime Minister Konoye before the war that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but had absolutely no confidence beyond that. Those 6 months were now over. The wild running had ended in the waters off Midway. What came next would be something different, something grimmer. Japan would be fighting, not for victory but for survival, not to expand but to hold, not with confidence but with desperation. The Admiral opened the small writing desk in his cabin and withdrew his personal journal, something he maintained separate from official logs and reports. His brush moved across the paper with practiced strokes, forming characters that captured thoughts he could share with no living person. "I have visited the United States and know the industrial capacity they possess," he wrote. "Our early victories made many in Tokyo forget this reality. Perhaps I too allowed success to cloud my judgment." The Midway operation was sound in theory, but failed to account for American determination and adaptability. We assumed their carriers would behave according to our predictions. Instead, they surprised us completely. "The fault is mine alone." He paused, his brush hovering over the paper as memories flooded back. The exhilaration of receiving reports from Pearl Harbor, the pride in watching his carefully trained pilots execute their missions with precision, the satisfaction of seeing his strategic vision validated by month after month of victories. All of that now felt like a dream from which he had awakened to find reality far harsher than he had allowed himself to imagine. The Americans had studied Japanese tactics, had learned from their defeats, and had turned Japan's own methods against them. The student had become the master, or perhaps more accurately, had revealed that they had never been as inferior as Japanese propaganda had insisted. What troubled Yamamoto most was what he would tell the emperor. Admiral Nagano and the Naval General Staff would want to minimize the disaster, to frame it as a temporary setback that could be overcome with determination and sacrifice. But Yamamoto had never been comfortable with comfortable lies. The emperor deserved truth, even if that truth was devastating. Japan had lost the strategic initiative. The defensive perimeter was now vulnerable. The Americans would come, and they would keep coming, and each time they came, they would be stronger, while Japan grew weaker. The most agonizing task facing the staff officers aboard Yamato was composing notifications to the families of the dead and missing. Normally, such messages followed established protocols, honoring the sacrifice of fallen warriors with language that emphasized glory and duty fulfilled. But how did one write such letters when the deaths seemed so wasteful, when tactical errors and intelligence failures had sent thousands of men to deaths that might have been prevented? Lieutenant Commander Fujii, whose brother had died on Kaga, volunteered for this duty despite his personal grief. Perhaps because of it. He understood what the families would need to hear, even if those words could never capture the full truth. The letters had to navigate impossible territory. They must honor the dead without revealing the magnitude of the disaster. They must provide comfort without offering false hope to families whose sons and husbands were listed as missing but were certainly dead. They must maintain the fiction of honorable sacrifice, while the officers writing them wrestled with questions about whether the sacrifice had been necessary or wise. Fuji's brush moved slowly across the rice paper as he composed notification after notification, each one a small masterpiece of carefully chosen words that said everything and nothing simultaneously. Your son died bravely in service to the emperor, fighting with courage and distinction. He wrote this phrase dozens of times, each repetition making it feel more hollow. The truth was that many of the men had died trapped below decks as fires consumed the ships, or had drowned in fuel oil-slicked water, or had suffered for hours with terrible burns before succumbing. There had been courage, certainly. Japanese sailors and pilots had fought desperately to save their ships and their comrades, but there had also been chaos and terror and suffering that the families would never be told about. The letters would present clean narratives of sacrifice and honor because anything else was unthinkable. What made the task even more painful was knowing that many families would receive no notification at all for weeks or even months. The scale of the losses meant that casualty lists were incomplete and would remain so for some time. Ships' rosters had been destroyed when the carriers sank. Survivors scattered across multiple vessels often did not know which of their shipmates had escaped and which had perished. Some families would spend months hoping for news that their loved ones were prisoners or had somehow survived, when in reality those men had died in the first minutes of the attack. The limbo of not knowing would be its own special torture. Radio operator Maeda was responsible for transmitting these notifications back to Japan, and the work was breaking something inside him. Each message represented a family that would soon receive the worst news of their lives. Each transmitted notification would transform a household from hopeful to grieving in the time it took to deliver an envelope. He thought about his own mother waiting in Osaka, how she would react if one of these messages bore his name. The thought made his hands shake so badly that he had to pause and collect himself before continuing his work. This was the true cost of war. Not the strategic assessments and casualty statistics, but the individual moments of devastation that would ripple through thousands of homes across Japan. By the afternoon of June 8th, enough information had been compiled for the senior officers to understand not just what had happened, but how it had happened. The post-battle analysis sessions aboard Yamato were brutal exercises in confronting failure. Captain Kuroshima led these discussions with a methodical attention to detail that left no room for face-saving excuses or comfortable rationalizations. Every decision point was examined, every assumption was challenged, every failure was documented with painful precision. The officers who participated in these sessions left them feeling as though they had been flayed alive, but they also left understanding exactly how the unthinkable had occurred. The first critical failure had been in reconnaissance. Japanese search patterns on the morning of June 4th had been inadequate, with gaps in coverage that allowed American carriers to approach undetected. The cruiser Tone had launched its scout planes 30 minutes late due to catapult problems, and that 30-minute delay had proven catastrophic. When Tone's No. 4 scout finally spotted the American task force, Nagumo's carriers were already committed to a second strike on Midway Island. The float plane's radio message had been ambiguous, failing to specify whether enemy carriers were present. By the time clarification arrived, precious minutes had been lost. The second failure had been in decision-making. When reports confirmed American carriers in the area, Nagumo faced an agonizing choice. His flight decks were crowded with aircraft armed with bombs and torpedoes intended for Midway's land installations. Switching their armament to ship-killing weapons would take time during which his carriers would be vulnerable. He made the decision to rearm, judging that a properly equipped strike force would be more effective than a hastily launched attack. It was a reasonable decision based on standard doctrine. It was also the decision that left his carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with armed and fueled aircraft crowded together on the hangar decks when American dive bombers appeared overhead. The third failure had been in air defense. Japanese combat air patrol procedures had proven inadequate against the type of attack the Americans employed. Fighter aircraft were positioned at lower altitudes to intercept torpedo bombers, which had been the primary threat in previous engagements. When American dive bombers attacked from high altitude, the Zeros were out of position and unable to intercept effectively. The carrier's anti-aircraft fire had been intense but insufficient. American pilots had pressed their attacks with a determination and skill that exceeded Japanese expectations. 3 carriers had been hit within minutes of each other, transforming the battle in an instant. Commander Genda, speaking from his hospital bed with obvious pain but unwavering honesty, summarized the tactical lessons with brutal clarity. "We became complacent," he told the assembled officers. "We expected the Americans to behave as they had in previous battles, cautiously and predictably. Instead, they adapted. They learned from their defeats and changed their tactics. We assumed our superiority in training and equipment would overcome any disadvantage. We were wrong." The silence that followed his words was profound. These were officers trained to believe in Japanese superiority, in the spiritual power of Yamato Damashi to overcome material disadvantages. Genda was telling them that belief was not enough, that the Americans had closed the quality gap while maintaining their advantage in resources. In the carrier Zuikaku, which had been held in reserve and had not participated in the Midway operation, the surviving pilots of the Kido Butai gathered to mourn their fallen comrades. These men had trained together for years, had shared the triumph of Pearl Harbor, had flown together across the Pacific as an invincible formation. Now more than half of them were gone. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga had led the first strike on Midway Island, knowing his plane was damaged and could not return, yet he had flown anyway. He died when Hiryu was bombed, never making it back to his carrier. Lieutenant Commander Takashige Egusa, one of Japan's most skilled dive bomber pilots, had been killed aboard Soryu. The list went on, each name representing not just a lost pilot but irreplaceable expertise. Flight Petty Officer Haruo Yoshino sat in the ready room holding a photograph of his squadron mates from Akagi. Of the 18 men in the photo, only 4 remained alive. The others had died in their aircraft during the attack, or had gone down with the carrier, or had been pulled from the water too badly burned to survive. Yoshino had been reassigned to Zuikaku just weeks before Midway for additional training. That random administrative decision had saved his life while condemning his closest friends to death. The guilt he felt was overwhelming. Why had he survived when better pilots had perished? What right did he have to live when so many had died? The veterans understood what the younger pilots did not yet grasp. The men lost at Midway could not be replaced. Japan's naval aviation training program could produce new pilots, but it could not produce instant experience. The dead had accumulated thousands of flight hours, had mastered their aircraft through countless exercises, had developed the intuitive understanding of tactics that only comes from actual combat. A new pilot might learn to fly a Zero or a dive bomber, but he could not learn in months what the veterans had learned over years. The gap would grow wider with each engagement as experienced American pilots accumulated combat experience, while Japanese replacement pilots were thrown into battle with inadequate preparation. What haunted the survivors most was the knowledge that their friends had died for a strategic objective that had failed completely. If the sacrifice had secured Midway, if it had destroyed the American carriers, perhaps their deaths could be understood as necessary costs of victory. But they had died in a defeat so complete that it negated everything the Kido Butai had accomplished in the previous 6 months. Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raid, the months of dominance, all of it now seemed like prologue to this catastrophe. The pilots who remained knew they would be called upon to fill the gaps left by the dead, to fly more missions with fewer resources against an enemy that was growing stronger. They would do their duty because that was what Japanese warriors did. But they would do so knowing that the war had fundamentally changed and not in Japan's favor. The wireless room received a coded message on the evening of June 8th that sent a chill through every officer who learned of its contents. The Emperor requested a personal audience with Admiral Yamamoto upon the fleet's return to Japan. The message was phrased with the usual formal courtesy, but everyone understood its true meaning. Emperor Hirohito wanted an explanation for how the navy he had entrusted with Japan's destiny had suffered its worst defeat in modern history. Yamamoto read the message without visible reaction, then carefully folded it and placed it inside his uniform jacket, close to his heart. He knew this audience would be the most difficult moment of his life. The relationship between the emperor and his military commanders was complex and bound by centuries of tradition. The emperor did not directly command military operations, but he granted authority to his commanders who acted in his name. Every victory was achieved in service to the throne. Every defeat was a failure to uphold the sacred trust placed in military leaders. Yamamoto had assured the emperor that the Midway operation would eliminate America's carrier threat and secure Japan's defensive perimeter. Instead, he had squandered 4 irreplaceable carriers and thousands of lives in a catastrophic failure. How did one face the living God and explain such a betrayal of trust? Admiral Ugaki watched his commander struggle with this burden and understood that Yamamoto was considering options that went beyond mere resignation. In the samurai tradition, a warrior who failed in his duty to his lord had one honorable path remaining. Seppuku, ritual suicide, was the ultimate acceptance of responsibility. Ugaki had seen the way Yamamoto's hand occasionally moved to rest on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was contemplating whether his death might somehow atone for the deaths of so many under his command. The chief of staff resolved to watch Yamamoto carefully and ensure he did not make any irrevocable decisions in the depths of his despair. What made the emperor's summons even more painful was knowing that Hirohito had personally approved the Midway operation based on Yamamoto's recommendations. The Navy Ministry and the Army General Staff had debated the plan extensively. Some had argued for a more conservative approach, consolidating gains rather than pursuing another offensive operation. But Yamamoto's reputation and his passionate advocacy had carried the day. The emperor had given his blessing to the operation, trusting that Japan's greatest naval strategist knew what he was doing. That trust had been betrayed not through cowardice or incompetence, but through the fog of war and the unpredictability of combat. Yet, the result was the same. The emperor's confidence had been misplaced, and Japan had paid a terrible price. Commander Watanabe found Yamamoto standing alone on Yamato's deck in the early morning hours, staring back toward the east where Midway lay beyond the horizon. The admiral spoke without turning. "I have served the emperor my entire adult life. I thought I knew what that service required. Now I understand I knew nothing." The words carried a weight of grief that no formal report could ever capture. In a converted storage room deep within Yamato's hull, a small team of staff officers worked on calculations that would never appear in official reports but which everyone knew represented the true strategic assessment. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omai, a specialist in logistics and industrial capacity, had been tasked with creating realistic projections of Japan's carrier aviation strength over the next 2 years compared to expected American production. The numbers he produced were so devastating that he checked them 3 times, hoping to find an error that would make them less catastrophic. There was no error. The mathematics were brutally clear. Japan had begun the war with 10 aircraft carriers of various sizes. With the loss of 4 fleet carriers at Midway, plus the light carrier Shoho lost at Coral Sea the previous month, that number was reduced to 5. Of those, Shokaku was under repair from damage sustained at Coral Sea and would not be operational for months. New carrier construction would add perhaps 3 to 4 carriers over the next 18 months if everything went perfectly, which it never did. By the end of 1943, Japan might have 8 or 9 operational carriers if no further losses occurred. That last assumption was, of course, wishful thinking. American carrier strength told a different story. Intelligence reports indicated that the United States currently had 7 fleet carriers operational or nearly operational. But American shipyards were producing carriers at a pace that seemed almost impossible. The Essex-class program alone called for building more than 20 fleet carriers. The Independence-class light carriers would add another 9. These were not projections or hopes but actual ships under construction with firm completion dates. By the end of 1943, the United States would have approximately 30 carriers operational. By the end of 1944, perhaps 40 or more. The ratio was not just unfavorable, it was apocalyptic. Omei's calculations extended beyond mere hull counts to the more critical question of trained pilots and aircraft production. Japan's current pilot training pipeline could produce approximately 1,500 new naval aviators per year. America's vastly larger program was projected to produce over 10,000. Even if the quality of Japanese pilots remained superior, which was increasingly questionable, the numerical disparity would be overwhelming. Aircraft production showed similar patterns. Japan could manufacture perhaps 15,000 military aircraft per year across all services. American production was already approaching 50,000 per year and climbing rapidly. The staff officers studying these numbers sat in silence after Omei finished his presentation. They had all known intellectually that America's industrial capacity exceeded Japan's, but seeing the actual projections made abstract knowledge concrete and terrifying. Captain Kuroshima finally spoke what everyone was thinking. We cannot win a war of attrition. Our only hope was to achieve decisive victories early that would force a negotiated peace. Midway was supposed to be that decisive victory. Instead, it has ensured that the war will become exactly the type of grinding attrition contest we cannot survive. No one contradicted him because no one could. The mathematics were absolute and unforgiving. The human toll of Midway finally broke through the rigid military composure on the evening of June 9. Captain Aoki, who had commanded Akagi and had been among the last to abandon her, sat alone in an empty briefing room aboard one of the escorting cruisers and wept openly for the first time since childhood. His ship had been more than steel and machinery to him. She had been his home, his responsibility, his honor. He had walked her decks every day, had known the names of hundreds of her crew members, had felt pride in commanding one of Japan's most prestigious vessels. Now she lay at the bottom of the Pacific, and with her lay men who had trusted him to bring them safely through battle. Admiral Nagumo's breakdown came more quietly, but no less completely. In the early morning hours, his aide found him sitting motionless in his cabin, staring at a blank wall. When the aide spoke to him, Nagumo did not respond. When touched on the shoulder, he flinched as if struck. The admiral who had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had led the Kido Butai across the Pacific in triumph, had retreated to some interior space where words could not reach him. The aide quietly withdrew and informed senior staff that the admiral was unwell and should not be disturbed. Everyone understood what that meant. The weight of 4,000 deaths had finally crushed the man who bore ultimate tactical responsibility for them. Even Yamamoto, known for his iron self-control, allowed his composure to crack in the presence of his oldest friend, Admiral Ugaki. The two men had served together for decades, had risen through the ranks supporting each other, had shared confidences that could never be voiced to subordinates. Late one night, as Yamato steamed through dark waters toward Japan, Yamamoto spoke words that Ugaki would never record in his official diary, but would remember for the rest of his life. I have killed them all, Isoroku. Every pilot who died screaming in those fires, every sailor who drowned in the dark. I killed them as surely as if I had put a pistol to their heads. And for what? For a plan that failed. For assumptions that were wrong, for my own arrogance in believing I could outsmart the Americans. Ugaki had no words of comfort because there was no comfort to be given. He sat with his friend in silence, two old warriors confronting the limits of their wisdom and the consequences of their failures. The tears that finally came from Yamamoto were not tears of self-pity but of grief for the men he had sent to their deaths and rage at his own inability to save them. These were emotions that could never be shown to the crew, that could never appear in official communications, that would be locked away behind the mask of command as soon as dawn broke. But in the privacy of that cabin, two admirals allowed themselves to be human, to feel the full weight of what Midway had cost, to grieve not just for ships and strategic positions, but for individual men whose lives had been entrusted to their care and who would never go home. The combined fleet reached Japanese waters on June 13, 1942, and the truth could no longer be contained. Despite strict censorship orders, rumors of a major disaster had already spread through the naval bases. Families waiting for news saw the fleet return without four of its most powerful carriers and understood that something catastrophic had occurred. Dock workers counted the ships that arrived and noted the ones that did not. Medical personnel rushed to treat burned and wounded survivors and saw injuries that told stories no official communique could hide. The carefully constructed narrative of Japanese invincibility began to crumble in the face of undeniable physical evidence. The Naval General Staff convened emergency sessions to determine how much information should be released to the public. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, argued for complete suppression of the details. The public should be told only that a battle had occurred at Midway with some losses on both sides. Yamamoto, to the surprise of many, argued for greater transparency. The Americans would certainly publicize their victory. Japanese citizens would eventually learn the truth from enemy broadcasts. Better to control the narrative than to allow it to be shaped entirely by American propaganda. His arguments were overruled. The official announcement would minimize the defeat and claim that American losses had been significant enough to offset Japanese casualties. The announcement, when it came, was a masterpiece of deception and misdirection. It acknowledged the loss of one carrier, Hiryu, while claiming that Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had been damaged but were returning to port for repairs. It reported the sinking of two American carriers when in fact none had been lost. It described the operation as a tactical setback rather than a strategic disaster. Most Japanese citizens, conditioned by months of victory announcements and lacking access to alternative information sources, accepted the official story. But within the military, everyone knew the truth. The whispers spread through every naval installation, every army barracks, every government ministry. Japan had suffered a devastating defeat, and the implications would reshape the entire war. The Emperor's private audience with Yamamoto occurred on June 16 in the Imperial Palace. No official record was kept of their conversation, but those who saw Yamamoto afterward said he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in an hour. He never spoke of what transpired in that meeting, but his actions afterward suggested he had been given both forgiveness and a burden. The Emperor had not demanded his resignation or his death. Instead, he had been ordered to continue serving, to use his expertise to salvage what could be salvaged, to fight on despite the changed strategic circumstances. It was, in many ways, a harsher sentence than death would have been. Yamamoto would have to live with his failure and work to repair the damage it had caused. Within the Imperial Japanese Navy, senior officers began the painful process of adjusting to a new reality. The offensive phase of the war was over. Japan would now fight defensively, trying to hold territory already gained, while hoping that American will to continue the war might eventually weaken. 15 months after Midway, Admiral Yamamoto would die when American fighters ambushed his transport aircraft over Bougainville. Intelligence intercepts had revealed his flight schedule, and the United States had sent their best pilots to kill the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. When news of his death reached Japan, many wondered if he had welcomed it, if flying into danger had been his final act of atonement for Midway. Admiral Nagumo would survive until July 1944, when he committed suicide during the American invasion of Saipan, finally choosing the death he had been denied at Midway. The admirals who had wept in private would eventually face their reckoning in various ways, some in battle, some in the war crimes tribunals that followed Japan's surrender. But the true legacy of June 7, 1942, was not in the fates of individual commanders. It was in the fundamental shift in the Pacific War's trajectory that occurred in those 5 minutes when American dive bombers found Japanese carriers vulnerable and unprepared. Everything that followed, the island-hopping campaigns, the submarine warfare that strangled Japan's economy, the eventual firebombing of Japanese cities, and the atomic weapons that ended the war, all of it became possible because 4 carriers burned at Midway. The mathematics that Lieutenant Commander Omae had calculated proved accurate. American carrier strength grew exponentially while Japanese strength declined. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy that had once ruled the Pacific was a shadow of its former self, unable to challenge American naval dominance. The admirals aboard Yamato on that terrible June morning had understood immediately what many in Tokyo would take months or years to accept. The war was lost. Not in the sense that defeat was immediate or inevitable, but in the sense that the path to victory had disappeared. Japan could still fight, could still win battles, could still inflict casualties on its enemies, but the strategic initiative had passed permanently to the United States, and with it went any realistic hope of achieving Japan's war aims. Everything after Midway was simply determining how long the war would last and how many more would die before the inevitable conclusion. Years later, when historians studied the turning points of World War II, they would debate whether Midway truly was as decisive as it seemed. Some would argue that Japan's industrial limitations meant it could never have won, regardless of Midway's outcome. Others would point to subsequent battles and campaigns as equally important, but for the men who were there, who watched those carriers burn and understood immediately what it meant, there was no debate. They had witnessed the moment when the empire's spine broke, when confidence became doubt, when the future shifted from Japanese dominance to American ascendancy. They had lived through the day when everything changed, and they carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. The weight of 4 flat tops, the mathematics of irreversible defeat, the breaking of invincibility, all of it could be traced back to June 7, 1942, the day Japanese admirals knew they had, in the words that would echo through history, fucked up beyond any possibility of redemption.